Let me just start off, Lewis, by saying, one, thank you for asking me to do this. I'm honored beyond belief that you would choose me to ask you questions and educate for posterity people about what is a remarkable life and career that you've had. My name is Steve Fega, and I am a friend and colleague of Lewis's. We worked together for decades, and we are still working together. And Lewis is a former assistant United States attorney who was chief of the criminal division over there for 20 years, and then he was named by the President of the United States to become the United States attorney for the Middle District of Alabama, and just retired just last year, in May or June of last year, and is now working. We're back together again. He's working with me in my second career at the Alabama Securities Commission. And so, Lewis, what I would like to do so people can know a little bit about you is to ask you if you could start out with a little bit of your life history, and perhaps where were you born?
I was born, excuse me, I was born here in Montgomery, specifically at Maxwell Air Force Base, April the 2nd, 1958.
Gotcha. Now, how is it that you were born at Maxwell Air Force Base?
My father was in the Air Force, and so we had base privileges, and so all of me and my siblings were born on military bases. 3 were born at Maxwell, and 1 was born in Detroit. And I forget the name of the base in Detroit, but we lived in Detroit for a brief period of time.
Okay. So tell me about your dad. What was his name?
His name was Harold Franklin. He was a native of Montgomery. My grandfather grew up here, my father, and as did my grandparents on my father's side. We have a history of being here in Montgomery that I can go back at least to my great-great-grandmother here in Montgomery.
Well, and I want to talk about that too. Let me ask you about that. What was your grandfather's name on your dad's side?
His name was Aaron Franklin.
Okay, and what did he do for a living?
Did a little bit of everything. He was what we refer to these days as kind of a hustler. He was retired as a bellman for the Holiday Inn. Specifically the one that used to sit out on the corner of the Eastern Bypass and I-85.
I remember that one well.
Yes, but he had worked for the Holiday Inn for most of what I can remember at various Holiday Inns that existed here in Montgomery. There was one right here on Madison Avenue, and there was another one out on the corner of the Southern Bypass and Mobile Highway. And so, as a child, I remember we had privileges of going to swim in the pool while he was on duty. And later on in life, in between college and while in grad school, I would be a bellman at that same Holiday Inn that he worked at.
I want to talk about that some a little bit, but I want to explore your family history a little bit more. What was your father's mother's name? Where was she from?
My father's mother's name was Ruth Ross. They were not married very long. I believe that they married when he was 16 and she was about 14. And they had one child, my dad. They divorced, as I recall, after being married about a year. And she would later move to New York. So she was not really part of my growing up, but my grandfather was a huge part of my growing up here in Montgomery and until he passed away.
Now, how is that? How is it that he was a huge part of your life when you were growing up?
My first recollection of where I lived here in Montgomery was a street called Travis Street, off of Oak Street here in Montgomery, a little dirt road. And I remember living there in that house, and I would see my grandfather almost every day. He would come by the house, we would hang out, he and my dad would hang out, and he was just a very integral part of my life. He was just always around. We would spend time together.
Is there anything in particular that you remember that you learned from him that you carried with you through your life?
I think one of the best comments that he made about me and I recall it as a compliment.
It's okay to talk about those days. That's what we want to do today, Elizabeth. We want to compliment you today.
He told me once that, and this is when I was a summer. I was working as a dishwasher at the Holiday Inn and a busboy. He told me that I had a lot of my mother in me, and I took that as a compliment back then, because my mom was really one of my first heroes in my life, she and my dad.
Well, I had the pleasure and the honor of meeting your mother, and I would certainly agree with you about that. She was a remarkable woman. Tell us about your mother.
My mom grew up here in Montgomery as well. She was from Cecil, Alabama, which is not far from here. And she grew up, I think, in her latter years as a teenager and before eloping with my dad. She lived in the projects over in Trentham Court here in Montgomery, which have since been torn down and rebuilt. She was one of 9 children, and she was the 3rd oldest. And I remember her telling me that she was, because she was one of 9, that she helped raise the younger kids. And that was part of why she eloped with my dad when she was 16 years old. My dad graduated from Carver High School. She did not finish high school, but would go on to obtain her undergraduate and master's degree later on in life after having 4 children in her life.
And what did she pursue an avocation based on those bachelor and master's degrees that she obtained? Sort
of. My dad passed away when I was young. I remember in 1970, I was 12 years old. And he passed away, and my mother, there was a huge argument in the house before he passed away about whether or not she could work. He didn't want his wife to work. And so she had started a job at IBM as a librarian assistant. And she had not started to go back to school at that time, but after my dad passed away, she started going back to school. And she stayed with IBM for 30 years. And she retired as an executive secretary and a proctor for teaching classes on how to use IBM computers. But we lived in Huntsville at the time. And so my memories of her is her trying to raise 4 children and trying to go to school at night. She initially went to night school. When she met my dad, she went to Booker T. Washington, and she dropped out of Booker T. Washington to elope with my dad. She would later go back to night school at Carver High School here in Montgomery and complete her high school education at night. After my dad passed away, she would then enroll in Troy University, which was Troy State back then, in Huntsville. We were in high school when she did that. And she was just always in school working and trying to make sure we had what we had. We were kids.
Now, what about her mom and dad? Were they a part of your life?
My grandmother, her mother, was a huge part of my life until she passed away. My grandfather, I did not meet until the day of my wedding. I was 25 years old.
Well, tell me about your grandmother and what was her name?
Her name
on your mother's side.
On my mother's side, her name was Julia Franklin. And I need to stop and explain. Yes, my dad's name was Franklin, and my mom's name was Franklin, but that was from her second marriage. Her first marriage, she was married to an individual. My grandfather's name was George Slaughter. And he and my George Slaughter and my grandmother had 4 children. And then my grandmother, and I say divorced, he left Montgomery with some issue involving law enforcement and moved to Detroit, where he stayed until he passed away. Did not want to come back to Alabama. I don't know the full story about why he left, but when he came back, it was the day that I was marrying my wife here in Montgomery.
Did he come back for that reason?
For that reason. He came back, and I met him for the first time. I was 25 years old.
How about that? So You said that your mom and your dad eloped.
Yes.
How did they meet?
Not really sure. Not really sure how they met. The story always started with her leaving home and causing a big rift in her family between her and her mom. And I remember that my dad's mom was not real happy about the day he brought her home and introduced her as his wife. And my grandfather was very accepting of the fact. And my great-great-grandmother, who was alive at the time and a very big part of my life early on, she was very accepting of my mom coming to live with them over on Travis Street. And so my dad's mom would later move to New York. My dad was not raised by his mother. He was actually raised by his great-grandmother, who was my great-great-grandmother as a child, and so he lived with her. And his mom lived in New York, and she would return to Montgomery to live when I was in high school. And so that relationship between her and her grandkids kind of blossomed at that point. She would come here from time to time, but we didn't see her that much. My grandfather we saw on a daily basis.
Was your dad in the Air Force when he and your mom married?
Yes.
What did he do in the Air Force?
He was an MP in the Air Force. He had a very short career in the Air Force. He had to take a medical retirement. He was diagnosed with lupus when he was about 19. He just joined the Air Force at 18. So 19, he was diagnosed with lupus and had to leave the Air Force on a medical disability.
I know that to be the case. That's a disqualifying condition. I know you know about me. I was an Air Force lawyer for 33 years. So,
right.
That's a medical health condition that is a disqualifier. But hopefully he was able to obtain his disability benefits associated with that.
He was, and I remember it was quite the journey for him. He obtained it years later, but he did at some point. I have no recollection of my father ever working a job on a regular basis. He was retired. He attended several trade schools. He worked on electronics, the old TVs, radios. We had a room in the house when he passed away. There was a room in the house dedicated to him fixing TVs and radios with the tubes. And so I learned a little bit about that growing up, but he never had a regular job. It was either school or he was working on that. In fact, we lived here in Montgomery until I finished the second grade at St. Jude. And then we moved to Huntsville so that he could attend Drake Technical School in Huntsville, which is near Alabama, A&M, which is in Normal, Alabama, in Huntsville, Alabama. And so we lived in Huntsville for about 9 years after we left here.
And so how old were you when you moved to Huntsville from Montgomery?
I would have been 8 or 9.
Okay.
Yeah, probably 8. We had just finished the second grade. I had just finished the second grade. And so we hit Huntsville, and we were enrolled at a Catholic school in Huntsville called St. Joseph's, and went there for about a year or two and begged our parents to send us to public school because we were sick and tired of wearing the uniforms. And we wanted to go to school with other kids. And so we, after spending a couple of years at St. Joseph, then we started going to public school in Huntsville.
Is there any reason why your parents had you in private schools as opposed to public schools?
I don't know. It was not discussed. All I can recall is that we were always told that we were supposed to go to college. We're supposed to finish school, go to college. In fact, my older brother's name is Harold, and I did not know his real name until I was in 3rd grade, because my father had intended and told the world that he was going to attend Tuskegee. And so my brother's nickname was Skeegee, and to this day we still call him Skeegee. And I remember in the 3rd grade, distinctly remember somebody referring to him as Harold, because he was Harold Jr. and looking at him saying, "That's not your name." and his response was, "Yes, it is, fool. That's my name."
Sounds like a big brother.
Yeah, we had nicknames back then, and so it stuck. And so to this day, all of his friends refer to him as Ski, and they all want to know where that nickname came from, and that's where it came from.
Okay, let's time frame some of this a little bit. Just
Okay.
You were born, you said, in 1960.
58.
58.
Yeah.
Okay, and you lived here in Montgomery for 4 years before you moved to.
We lived here in Montgomery for about 8 years.
8 years,
before
okay.
moving to Huntsville.
Okay, and was that the time frame when you were living here that you mentioned earlier that both your grandmother and your great grandmother played significant roles in your life?
Yes.
And in what way and in what measure did they play that significant role?
In ways that they were always around. I remember my great-great-grandmother cooking in the kitchen. I remember when she became ill, and then my dad and my mom became her caretaker until she passed away. And I'm pretty sure that her passing away had something to do with us leaving and going to live in Huntsville, because she passed away when I was in the 2nd grade. It was just a terrible time in our family. It's the first time I ever saw my dad cry. But shortly after that, we moved to Huntsville. But she was just always a part of my life. Her name was Adeline Smith. And Adeline Smith died in her 90s. I don't know exactly how old she was. But she, and this is going back further, Steve, but just to put it in context, she had raised her daughter's children. She had 2 daughters who lived in 2 houses right next door to each other on Bragg Street here in Montgomery. And both daughters passed away after having children at a very early age. There were 3 children born to my great-grandmother, and there were 4 children. Well, no, there were 5, maybe even 6, born to my great-grandmother's sister. And I don't know the circumstances of how they passed away, just they were young. And so back then, I'm told that men didn't raise their children, that when if the wife passed away, if the mom passed away, the children would go live with the grandmother, and that's what happened. So my great-grandmother would go from house to house raising these 9 children, my grandfather and his siblings, and then my great-grandmother's other children who had passed away, 2 houses. So there was the Franklins and the Dacuses. And so, and this is a story that the whole family knows. And so her name was Adeline Smith, but they called her Mama. And Mama raised all 9 children. And when she got sick, she was living with us, with me and my family. And we helped her transition and took care of her till she passed away. That brings me back to the 2nd grade, and then 3rd grade, I'm in Huntsville, Alabama.
How long were you guys up in Huntsville?
9 years. 9 years.
So you went through what level of education in Huntsville?
Up until the 11th grade in high school. And my mother comes home one day and announces to her children that we are moving to Montgomery.
How old were you?
16 or 17.
And how did that go over?
Not well. Not well at all. By the time, and the ironic thing is that we spent all of our summers in Montgomery. We would come to Montgomery and we would be at our grandparents' houses in Montgomery for the summer. And we always wanted to come back to Montgomery. But after 9 years in Huntsville, we had life in Huntsville. My older brother was quite the athlete. He lettered in 3 or 4 sports in high school. My sister was cheerleader, softball.
What was her name?
Her name was Javis.
Okay.
Javis. It always gets pronounced Jarvis, but her name is Javis. And Javis was a very popular, pretty girl, my younger sister. And so she had a life in Huntsville as well.
I've met Javis, by the way. She's a great cook, too.
Yes. And quite the personality.
I got a few pounds on me as a result of Javis.
Yes, she did cook for us in all our major trials.
Yeah.
But we had a life. And I had a younger brother who was mentally challenged, who was born, and unfortunately not enough oxygen got to his brain during birth. And so he was born with that mental defect, and we took care of him.
What's his name?
His name is Warren.
Okay.
He's the youngest.
Right.
So 3 boys and 1 girl. But in the 11th grade, my brother was on the football team, and he had been on the wrestling team, and he ran track. He played basketball in junior high school, just an outstanding athlete. All 5'8" of him, but a good athlete nonetheless. I had joined the wrestling team the year before and had struggled to make my presence felt on the team. And after the junior season had just ended, when my mom made this announcement, I had just gone to the state and finished 3rd in the state in my weight class, and had positioned myself to be captain of the team the next year. And so now I'm moving to Montgomery. And we made a decision that my brother could stay in Montgomery to finish his last year of high school, because he was a senior.
Stay in Huntsville?
Stay in Huntsville to finish his last year. And one of the boys had to go with mom and the other 2 kids. And so I had to come to Montgomery. And I spent about 6 weeks at Lee High School for my junior year, and decided, I couldn't do Lee High School. So my senior year, I went to Carver High School, which, by the way, is where the kid who beat me at the state tournament in wrestling, that's where he was. And so I figured that if he beat me, that I needed to be on that team. And also, my parents went to Carver High School. I thought it was something special about being able to go back to the high school where my parents went. So I spent my senior year at Carver High School.
What was it about Lee that made you want to go to Carver?
They didn't practice off season.
Wrestling.
Wrestling. Yeah.
Now I want to talk to you about that, because I know I said earlier, I've known you a long time, and I know that wrestling is a huge part of your life, and had a tremendous role in forming you as and your a lot of your ideas and thoughts as a man, and I know from some experience with that, because my son was a wrestler. They didn't have wrestling in high school when I went to Jeff Davis here, and they didn't have a wrestling team at Jeff Davis. They started a program the year after I graduated in wrestling, but my son was a wrestler all through high school, and I know the tremendous impact it had on him. I'd like for you to share with people what wrestling did for you, and let's start out with what weight class did you wrestle at? What kinds of personal travails did you go through pursuing that very, very arduous sport?
Well, let's put it in context first. So as a kid, I was extremely small. You can't tell that now, but and just very small. From my dad was an athlete. He played basketball. He ran track, and he was a pretty good swimmer. He was a lifeguard. So from the day we were born, he had us competing with other kids and with each other from the day we were born. My brother grew a little bit. I didn't grow much at all. So by the time I got to the 10th grade, I couldn't play basketball because I was too short. I couldn't play football because I didn't weigh 100 pounds. And that was the rule. You had to weigh at least 100 pounds before you could even go out for the team. In the 10th grade, I weighed 83 pounds. The lowest wrestling weight class in high school is 98. And so it was a sport that I just was drawn to. It was something that I did in the neighborhood with the other kids. We didn't call it wrestling, we called it tussling. I was always tussling with other kids in the neighborhood and was pretty good at it to be so small. And so to find that sport in the 10th grade and to be as small as I was, obviously not a lot of success, but I actually enjoyed the sport so much. And I remember that first year being beat out for the lowest position, the 98-pound weight class, by a kid who weighed 98, who was in the 9th grade. And my brother took a lot of heat for that. It's like, yeah, you're a pretty good athlete, but your brother sucks, sort of thing. But I stayed with it that first year, was on the junior varsity team. And then the second year still had worked my way up to 98 pounds. And that second year had a pretty successful season, which ended with me finishing 3rd in the state. I think my record was like 30-5 or something like that. Had a pretty good year. And it was such a sport that, you know me, I'm a rules guy. And, you know, the rules always mattered to me. And in other sports, you were counting on other people for your success. This was one sport where you lived and died based on your success. And so I didn't have to worry about the weight of my opponent. He was going to be my size, and everything was pretty much even at that point. It was one-on-one, and either you bested your opponent or your opponent bested you. And you know, and it did. It played a huge part in my life because I had to learn the sport, and I had to try to master it. And I think I did over time. So losing in the state tournament to the kid from Carver was kind of devastating to me. But it was just my second year. And so I would come here to Montgomery and finish my senior year and do the same thing again, lose in the semifinal round and end up finishing 3rd again, but at a higher weight class. I had moved up to a whopping 105 pounds my senior year in high school. So, and it was a huge influence on me because it taught me about hard work. It taught me about struggling. It taught me how to win and to lose. And it taught me how to accept criticism from my coach, who was extremely hard on me. I can't repeat how he said it, but when you're on the mat, the world just kind of stops, except for my coach's voice. I can remember him screaming my name when I was losing and telling me what I should be doing. And very critical. The year that I came out from having not being able to beat anybody on the team to being positioning myself to be one of the leaders on the team my junior year, I lost to a kid once, and we came back to it was the first tournament I had gone to. I finished in 2nd place. I thought I had done pretty good, but it wasn't good enough for my coach. And I remember him just being awful in practice and calling that kid's name and telling me what I did wrong. And it went on and on and on. As it would turn out, he is the only kid who I lost to 5 times. 5. But he was just a better wrestler than I was at that point in my career. But my coach was relentless in being critical about what mistakes I made, what I needed to do to correct them, and how nothing was going to do that but working harder and listening to his instructions. And that stayed with me throughout my life when I would, and I'll fast forward to law school. The first year of law school was very difficult, and I had to learn how to transition what I had learned in sport to academics. And in other words, you know, the only thing that makes you better is hard work and practice. And so when struggling, you go back to the basics. And so I would spend more hours studying so that I could do the work in law school. And that's part of my training from wrestling. And that's why it's so important to me. And it paid for the first 2 years of college too.
We're going to talk some more about your education, but I want to stick with this wrestling just that far, because you pursued that beyond high school. You also
Yes.
pursued a wrestling avocation in college. Is that right?
That's right.
Did that have anything to do with where you decided to go to college? And let's talk about what you did with wrestling in college.
It had everything to do with where I went to college. The lowest weight class in college is 118. I graduated high school, I weighed approximately 112 pounds.
So you're that rare wrestler that had to gain weight to get in your weight class. That's really unusual, isn't it, in that sport?
I am. It is.
Yep.
I had been accepted at Jacksonville over in Anniston and was poised to go to college, and I got a call from my high school coach, different coach, by the way, Coach Sykes here in Montgomery. And he said, "You still want to wrestle?" And I was like, "Sure, Coach." Yeah. He said, "There's a guy that's starting a program over in Phoenix City, Alabama at a junior college called Chattahoochee Valley Community College." He said, "And I told him about you, and he wants to meet you." And so we got in the car, me and another wrestler with the coach. We drove over to Phoenix City. We met the coach, and I was offered a scholarship on site. The guy had never seen me wrestle, and so I accepted the scholarship and ended up at Chattahoochee Valley for 2 years, where I wrestled. And it's odd because the coach was not really a wrestling coach. He was a baseball coach, and his son was a wrestler. And so he started the program at Chattahoochee Valley to keep his son close to home. So his son was on the team. I received a scholarship. Another kid from Carver High, Johnny, and I can't think of Johnny's last name. So we went to Chattahoochee Valley, and we wrestled at Chattahoochee Valley for 2 years.
I'm guessing that guy that beat you 5 times didn't follow you there.
No, he did not.
Okay.
No. His name I remember.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that he's in the history books for having been undefeated from his 9th grade through his senior year in high school. Yeah, went to Gardendale High School.
It's interesting. Like you said, you were a senior, I think, at the outset of the interview when we were talking, and I am as well. You have a son who's named after you. I have a son who's named after me, and we both have grandsons who are named after us as well, right?
Yes.
We're going to talk about that. So I want to jump and segue a little bit and ask you, you're married.
I am.
How long have you been married?
38 years.
And what's your wife's name?
Lucretia.
And can you tell us how you and Lucretia met?
We met at McDonald's on Fairview.
How'd that happen?
McDonald's on Fairview back in the 70s was the spot to go to for all kids after every sporting event in Montgomery. And McDonald's on Fairview stayed open till 2 o'clock in the morning because they were still doing business. Everybody was hanging out. Everybody, if you had a car, you were showing off your car at McDonald's. If you won whatever event you were involved in, sporting event, you went to McDonald's. And my wife worked at McDonald's. During the summers that I would come home from Chattahoochee Valley, I would work at McDonald's as well. My sister worked there. My younger sister, she worked there. And so she talked to the manager, and the manager allowed me and my brother to work there in the summers. And so my brother would introduce me to Lucretia as somebody he thought I would be interested in. And so we met as employees at McDonald's on Fairview.
Apparently you were interested.
Very interested.
Okay. So did y'all start dating at that time?
A little bit. By that time I had finished the junior college and had started at University of Alabama. And so we dated for about a year in college, and then went our separate ways and would later reignite the relationship after we had both finished college. She was working for the Social Security Administration in Anniston. I was working for Alabama Department of Youth Services in Birmingham, and ran into a mutual friend and asked where she was, and just we reconnected from there, and had a serious courtship this time around.
Gotcha. What were you doing with the federal agency that you said you were employed with up there?
It was a state agency. It was Department of Youth Services. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Alabama Department of Youth Services. I was what was called a child care worker, and for a year and a half or 2 years. And the last year I was there, I was the assistant director of a work release group home for juveniles, the only one of its kind in the state.
Okay. Where did Crucia attend school?
She went to Alabama A&M
Okay.
in Huntsville, Alabama.
She started and finished there?
She started and finished there.
And what did she study, and what did she wind up doing?
She was a communications major, and she ended up working for the Social Security Administration right out of college for a while. And she, about around the time we married, she left the Social Security Administration and started going back to school.
What for?
She was trying to become, and I'm not sure what the title of what you study, but human resource management. So.
Okay. So where I'm trying to get to is, how did she wind up becoming a teacher?
So she became a teacher. She had a couple of jobs. So she worked for Social Security Administration. She worked as a waitress and started going to night school. I interrupted that career by deciding to go to law school. We were living in Birmingham. We moved from Birmingham to Washington, D.C. while I was going to law school. She worked for an engineering firm in law school and for an outfit called Casual Corner, which is a retail store for women, which was one of her favorite jobs in the world, by the way, because it allowed her to get clothes really, really cheap. And so while I was in law school, she worked those two jobs until Louis was born. And after Louis was born, because he was born while I was in law school.
And when was that?
In 1986.
Okay.
During my second year of law school.
Okay. And you have another child?
I do. I have a daughter whose name is Jasmine. Jasmine is 2.5 years younger than Louis, and she was born after we returned to Alabama, and I was working at Legal Services in Selma. She was born right here in Montgomery at Baptist Hospital.
Okay.
Because they didn't deliver kids in Selma. Yeah.
So they didn't deliver.
They did not deliver babies in Selma. There was something about lawsuits in Selma that they did not deliver babies at the hospital in Selma, Alabama in 1986.
So you
1989. Jasmine was born in 89.
So Lucretia came here, and you came
we
here
had to. Yeah, we had to come here. That's right. She was born here in Montgomery. Packed her little body up, and then took her back to Selma until I would get a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Okay. You spent your first 2 years at, you said, was it a junior college or a four-year college? Okay.
It's a junior college.
And then you mentioned just a minute ago, and I'm going to pick up with your education again now. So you left there after 2 years and were admitted to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa?
That's right. What is important for me is that while I was an athlete, I graduated from that junior college, something a lot of the athletes did not do. I graduated with a pretty good academic record at Chattahoochee Valley, and then I went to University of Alabama. My intention was to finish with my wrestling career 2 more years at wrestling, but was told by Auburn and University of Alabama that they had no scholarship money. And I did not believe them at the time, but I have since learned that Title IX was going into full force in effect about that time. And so a lot of the schools were shutting down their wrestling programs, and so they did not have any money. I actually, we called it auditioning then. I actually went over to Auburn that had a pretty good wrestling program and wrestled who they had in my weight class at the time. But they offered me no scholarship. And keep in mind, my wrestling paid for those 2 years of college. I had a fairly successful 2 years. Won a few tournaments, won what was the equivalent of the SEC championship, and was voted most outstanding wrestler at that tournament in 1978. Went to the Nationals, did not place at the Nationals, but I put Alabama on the map by being the first one from the junior college to go to the national tournament. And surely somebody would give me money to go to school, but they did not.
What do you think Title IX had to do with that? And for those who won't be lawyers who may view this one day, just briefly, if you would, tell them what Title IX is. And
I am by no means an expert on it, but what it meant was that money that had been set aside for male athletes was now being set aside for female athletes. And so female athletics, which had not been, to my knowledge, that prevalent in the schools that I went to, suddenly you had programs that women were participating in. And so wrestling died a slow death as a result of Title IX at the University of Alabama, and then later at Auburn University as well.
I know that that's the case because we moved here. My father was in the Air Force too, as you know. Mm-hmm. And we moved here when he came back from Vietnam in 1971. And I remember my older sister, who was a field hockey and lacrosse player, being extraordinarily disappointed to find out that there were absolutely no girls' athletics at Jefferson Davis High School.
Beyond
Nothing.
Cheerleading, flag girl, and dance team.
They didn't have any athletics.
That's right.
And so, but Title IX fixed all of that. So I think by large measure, most people think it's a good thing, but there were some unintended negative consequences, obviously. Yeah. So, when you got to Alabama, were you wrestling? Did you wrestle?
No.
Gave that up? What did you do then? What did you study at Alabama, and what did you wind up majoring in?
I began studying criminal justice because I wanted to go to law school. I had received my pre-law degree, Associate of Arts degree from Chattahoochee Valley. Went to Alabama and started in I take that back. Started in poli-sci, political science, and found it to be one of the most boring subjects I've ever read about. And so I went to my guidance counselor. I told him, I said, look, I'm having trouble staying awake in these classes. I need something else to study. And he asked me what I was interested in, and he suggested that criminal justice would be a good course to pursue, or degree to pursue. And I started taking the classes and just fell in love with the criminal justice classes because for whatever reason, it was just more familiar to me. Political science was not, and nor was it interesting. So I ended up finishing and getting a degree in criminal justice and then returning home.
It's funny how some things are the result of decisions and accidents in life. You know, I think, and I want you to, I wanted to ask you: is there anything that during this time frame that we're talking about, up through your graduation from the University of Alabama, that was a fortuitous sort of a thing, that's something that you hadn't planned for, but that happened and worked out well for you?
I think going to the University of Alabama worked out well for me. I was deciding whether to go to Auburn or Alabama. The tipping scale for me was something that had happened years ago at the University of Alabama, and that was George Wallace standing in front of Foster Auditorium. And I thought that it would be, I don't know the quite the right way to describe it, but that stuck in my craw. I can't remember because the event happened in '63, and so I was 5 years old. I don't even remember when I saw it, but it stayed with me. And so I thought going to the University of Alabama was my way of saying, you know, you have to look at me. You have to recognize me. I'm here. At that time, there weren't many blacks going to the University of Alabama. I don't know what the population was. I just know that when we were down there, you didn't see a lot of black students down there, and we would speak to each other every time we saw one another. And so the first thing I did when I got to the University of Alabama was to go to Foster Auditorium. My first day that I walked into Tuscaloosa, because I went to the University of Alabama having never been on its campus. And so when I got there, the first thing I did, I went to Foster Auditorium because I wanted to see this place where this event had happened. I wanted to see this part of history. And I remember being so disappointed that it was just an old gymnasium, you know. And so, but that was part of the reason, that was the tipping scale that made me go to Alabama. I had friends on the wrestling team at Alabama. I had friends on the wrestling team at Auburn. So I wanted to go and continue to do that, but the lack of the scholarship just said, no, this is 5 months of my school year that you're asking me for. I need money to do this. But I did have, my dad was in the military, so I had the GI Bill, which paid for my tuition, books, fees, and had another stipend from Social Security, which would pay for my, my room and board. So, you know, I didn't need the money, but I thought I had earned the right to get the scholarship to go. And so I met another young man who wrestled over in Opelika, and we both decided, let's sit out this year. We spent a lot of time in the gym, and said, let's go back the next year and see if we can get some money next year, you know. It didn't happen that way. The program was just dying on the vine. And so I spent that first year playing, not studying, just playing. Had never been to a big school before. And it was just, made a lot of mistakes academically and had to pay for that later on. But it was the first time I'd been in school and was just absolutely free to do whatever I wanted to do. Because while I was wrestling, I had a regimen, you know. You practice, you practice, you practice, and then you went to class, and that was it. And so at Alabama, that was thrown out the window. Yeah.
You know, so much of your life and so much of what I know about you is professional. You know, we have a personal relationship as well, but you know, I know a great deal about your professional life. But one of the things that is, you know, a remarkable occurrence in your life, and for whatever reason, and I don't know how to intro it, so I'm just going to say it, but you're the first black U.S. attorney in the history of the Middle District of Alabama. And we're going to talk about your professional career in a little bit, but I want to ask you, you lived in Montgomery for, was that in the 60s?
Yes, part of it was in the 60s.
And then you said you moved to Huntsville, so you were in Alabama. So you grew up during, you know, a major part of a part of our history known as the Civil Rights Movement. Did any of that impact you? And if so, would you share with us? You know, what, as a youth growing up and going all the way through high school, did that impact your life in any way, or any of your family? And if you would just share on that subject.
It did. Unbeknownst to us, and by us I mean my father's kids, my dad was much more sick than they shared with us. We would later learn that at the time of his diagnosis and when they first started treating him, they gave him 2 years to live. And he lived about 12 after that. So he spent a lot of time with us. And he would talk about his participation in the bus boycott here in Montgomery, that he was a driver who would take people to where to work and other places they had to go during that time. He was a follower, a fan of Dr. King, and so his name was mentioned often in our house. But we, and I don't want to say we're shielded, but our environment was not. It was segregated. So all of my memories during my early years in elementary school, up until the time that I get to St. Joseph's in Huntsville, all the kids were black. Everyone went to school, to include Brown's Private, which was a preschool here in Montgomery. All the kids were black. All the teachers were black. At St. Jude, there were a few white teachers, but the majority of them that I remember, other than the nuns, they were all black. And so that part of, I heard about it, and they would talk about it. There was no effort to sit down and discuss it with us. You just heard parents talking about segregation. So when we left St. Joseph's in the 3rd grade, going into the 4th grade, I think that's correct. We went to the first integrated school, and there were people from other races. I remember there were Asians, and there were a few white people at St. Joseph's, not at St. Jude, but at St. Joseph's. And so we wanted to go to private school. We went to private school, and my recollection is that my brother, sister, and I, the 3 of us, were the only black kids at a school called Lakewood Elementary School, or Lakeview Elementary School in Huntsville, Alabama, that first year. I remember my dad coming up to the school all the time. I remember the fights after school. And one of the interesting things, and I always tell people this, is that the fights that occurred at the elementary school were the majority of white kids who stuck up for us while we were there at the school. You know, we had our share of fights too, but the majority of the fights were white kids fighting other white kids. And so that was my introduction to the issues about segregation and race. And it would continue from there. It would elevate itself probably in junior high school, where I remember there was an issue in our junior high school about the Afro pick. Remember the hairstyle, the Afro? Well, if you were in junior high school, you were trying to grow your hair as long as you could grow it, and you would pick it out. And the Afro pick had a symbol of a fist on it. One of them did, had a symbol of a fist. And it had wire prongs to put in your hair to pick your hair out. And they outlawed us bringing those to school as a weapon. And there were 2 black teachers at Chapman Junior High School who joined the fight to make sure. And I remember one of the teachers inartfully, Miss Washington, she was a history teacher, but just a fierce little woman. If they want to bring picks to school to comb their nappy heads, they ought to be able to bring picks to school. It's like, you couldn't pick a better way to say it, but that is the way she said it. And so we were allowed to do that. And then high school, at Lee High School in Huntsville, there was a huge Confederate flag that General Lee on a horse had in the gym. And so there was a huge fight to remove the flag. And rather than repaint the mural that was on the wall, they just painted over the flag. So General Lee on the horse only had one arm, which is what we were fighting for at the time. But that was my introduction to it. There were little incidents here and there. You know, we had access to the pool at Maxwell Air Force Base. There would be little incidents there, but my dad had taught us how to stand up for ourselves. And so usually the outcomes were pretty good. But yeah, we were introduced to that early, but it got worse as we moved away from our segregated neighborhoods into more integrated environments like junior high school, and then into college. So yeah, played a huge impact, made me personally made me want to be the best that I could be in anything that I would do. The thought that somebody would look down on me and think that I was less than them frustrated, irritated me, and pushed me to be better. So, and that came from my dad. Not so much from my mom, but from my dad, which, you know, was before he left us when I was 12 and stayed with me throughout my life. My mom would later come in the picture as pushing me to be better academically. She believed in school. She believed in academics. Wasn't a huge influence in teaching me how to be better, just told us we had to be better. And one of the things I tried to change with my kids, we were always told to make good grades, but nobody sat down with us and showed us how to do it in the house. You know, if you brought home something less than a C in the house, that was punishment in our house, even before my dad passed away. And so, you know, and I thought about it as I became a parent. It's like they kept telling us that, and they punished us if we didn't do it, but nobody sat down with us and said, You know what? This is the way you're studying. That's not working. Let's try something else. You know what? You might need a little help. We might need to get you a tutor. So I raised my kids a little differently, and but they still pushed academics. Their plan was that all of their children would go off to college somewhere, and so I did, and I feel like I have honored not just them but myself in doing so.
So it sounds like, and I want to make sure we get this straight, that early in your life you were living in what we know to have been a relatively segregated Montgomery, Alabama, and Alabama generally.
Yes.
But would you say that as a result of that, am I hearing you right, that you say as a result of that somewhat insulated you from the issues of segregation because you had good role models, good people who were basically bringing you up and keeping you insulated from the impact of that?
Yes.
And so it wasn't until later in life when you began to launch out into the world that you were, for the first time, confronted with having to actually engage on the issue.
That I would discover the inequities of being black in America. Yes, it took some time to kind of figure it all out, because it was not something that was discussed regularly with the children in the house. You know, I recall my childhood up until the point that my father passed away as being just a happy childhood. You know, even the idea that my dad was home on a regular basis, I thought that we were fortunate to have our dad. Other dads went to work, but we had our dad, and so, you know, we had a boat, and sometimes he would just put us on the, you know, take us out to Tennessee River, put us in the boat, and we just stay on the river all day going up and down the river. I mean, he spent a lot of time and always teaching my brother and I, you know, the different sports, the basic sports, how to play, you know. And so I always thought we were fortunate to have him at home. But after he passed away, then we were introduced to other things. I recall one incident that happened when before he passed away, and he was a no-nonsense kind of person, and he was much taller too. Unfortunately, my brother and I got our height from our mother.
You got a thing about thinking you're not tall enough. You've always looked plenty tall to me, Lewis. Yeah.
Well, my dad was he's 6'2" or 6'3".
Yeah.
Yeah. My mom is right at 5 feet tall. And so I am the tallest of their siblings, and I'm 5'9". But, you know, my dad had my brother in the car. We were in Huntsville when this incident happened, and my dad always kept a gun with him. I do remember that. And so he got into this altercation with a couple of white guys in a car, and my brother tells the story how, you know, they motioned my dad over into a parking lot of a convenience store, and my dad pulled over, and there was some shouting back and forth, a lot of name calling, and they told my dad that they were going to whip his ass and my brother too. And my dad, being who he was, invited them to try. So I think they got out of the car, and I think they had, if my memory serves me correctly, one of them had a piece of pipe and the other one had a baseball bat. And my dad pulled out his .32, which he normally had with him. And then there was the acknowledgement of inequity of situation. And the interesting part, as I think about it now, is my dad, he remembered that there were white people watching the incident and urging him to shoot these guys. And he did not. And I remember him telling us, he said, because who's going to take care of my family if I do this? But those kind of things, not a regular basis, but those are the kind of things that kind of shaped me in growing up and told you have to speak up for yourself. You have to make sure people know you and what your abilities are. And so in the wrestling context, And let me share with you one irony in my life, Steve, which I have shared with my kids. When I was younger, my father, he hated the fact that I would tussle with other kids. It drove him crazy because when you tussle with other kids, you tear up your clothes. You know, we didn't have gym shoes back then. We wore street shoes most of the time. But you had gym shoes too. And we had uniforms. And so when we came home from school, you know, you took those uniforms off and you folded and hung them up and you put them in the closet, that kind of thing. I remember a day I was out in the yard and I was tussling with a kid who was my age and taller, bigger than me. And I had bested him and I had put him on his back. And I think it had turned from tussling to fighting at that point. And I was standing over this kid, well, laying on top of him, trying to get my licks in. And I suddenly feel these licks across my back, shoulders, and head, and it's my dad. And he's hitting me with the newspaper, telling me, I have told, and I can't say what he would say, his famous, well, I'm going to say it anyway, his famous line for me, my nickname for him was your narrow ass, because I was so small. I've told you a little narrow ass about tearing up your clothes, because that's what he saw. You know, I thought I was doing a good thing. I had bested this other kid. And I remember getting up and I was crying and I ran into the house and I went straight to my mom and told her what he had done. And I was so angry and I said, I'm never going to speak to him again. And back then, parents stuck together unlike they do nowadays. And of course, she told him. And so later on, he would say to me, you know, he said, come here, boy. He said, your mama told me you had something you want to say to me. What do you have to say? And I dropped my head. Nothing. She said, you said you weren't going to speak to me. No, sir. You know, and the irony of that is that day in the yard while tussling, I think about that day and then fast forward to my last, well, the one before my last tournament, when I was standing on that podium and having been voted most outstanding wrestler in the conference. And I thought about, what would he say if he were here? It's just one of those ironies. And so there are these things that we learn as children, and I like to refer to them as the clothes that our parents put on us when we're kids. And we have to decide as we get older which of those clothes we're going to keep and which we'll discard. And so for me, there were lessons like that, him trying to discourage me from tearing up my clothes and me figuring out that, you know what, this is something I can do. This is something I'm pretty good at. I'm gonna discard that, and I'm gonna keep this lesson that I'm learning, this life lesson that I'm learning by participating in this sport. So I don't know if that gets right to your question, but that's something that I would want anybody watching this video to remember.
Well, and it presents me an opportunity because, you know, I'm a father of 4 and I have 5 brothers and sisters. And my father passed away. Fortunately, I was an adult and I had an opportunity to get to know my father as an adult, and I'm so grateful for that I got to know him, you know, not only as a child but as an adult. But I want to be the one to tell you that I know exactly what your father would have been thinking when you were standing on that podium. He would have been proud of you.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah. So
He'd have never admitted he was wrong, but thank you for that.
Your dad would have been proud of you, and he would have been proud of you a lot more on later occasions. But I can assure you of that. So you know that one. Your dad would have been proud of you.
Well, thank you.
Let's talk about law school. Where did you go to law school?
Howard University, Washington, D.C.
And when did you go up there?
1984.
Okay. Did you work while you were in law school?
No, I tried. Couldn't. I tried.
Okay. And you indicated that Crucia had jobs.
She did.
While you were up
She
there.
worked 2 jobs. we decided that we would go. The plan was to go to Howard to get the law degree and then come back to Alabama.
So we got to give Lucretia credit for helping you get through law school.
Absolutely. Could not have done it without her.
Yeah. So while you were in law school, was there a particular area of the law that you thought you would be interested in practicing?
Had always been interested in criminal law, always. In particular, juvenile law.
Why?
I just had an interest in kids, and help nurturing and teaching kids is something practicing law was not my first love. My first love was always to work with children. When I left the University of Alabama and I took the job with Alabama Department of Youth Services, I thought that's where I was supposed to be, working with kids, troubled kids, and helping them find their way. First problem with that is it's much harder than anybody ever thought it would be. Second problem with that is it doesn't pay very much. And so I ended up in law school after deciding, after working with those kids for almost 3 years, that there was something that I could do better with my life than what I was doing. And I actually I got sick and made a decision that this was the time to go to law school. And let me back up for a second. It's told as a joke in the family, but it did affect my decision to pursue law. My dad used to say when we were kids, and they talk about us going to college, he said, I want one of you, talking about my brothers, my sister was not in this equation, I want one of you to become a lawyer and I want the other one to be a doctor. He said, I want one of you to take care of me when I'm sick, and I want the other one to get me out of jail. And it was just a running joke in the house all the time. But it impacted me because it influenced my decision to go to law school. The next thing that influenced my decision was that I got really sick right after college. And so
what happened?
My second year at the University of Alabama, I started having problems with my joints and was diagnosed with having arthritis, really, really bad arthritis. And so that got worse when I finished school. I started getting just no energy, really, really sick, and I hadn't shared this with a lot of people, but ended up being in the hospital for 8 days and was diagnosed with lupus when I was 21 years old. Really scary moment. After the diagnosis and going through all kind of mental stuff in my head about what was going to happen to me, and keep in mind I was a pretty good athlete. It's like, where did this come from? And I remember when I was leaving the hospital, because they brought me to Birmingham. I spent 8 days in the hospital at Birmingham. My parents were in Montgomery, and so my mom, my stepdad, I was in my car, and I was going to drive home. I was dating a young lady in Birmingham. I drove to her house, and I had no energy to get home. This was after they released me from the hospital. I had the diagnosis, and my mom called. I called. We talked on the phone. I said, "Look, I can't, I don't have the energy to drive home. I know I'll fall asleep if I get in the car and come home." And she said, "We'll come get you." So they did. After that, I got married. And right after we got married, I spent another couple of days in the hospital. And this was the flu. But the flu hit me so hard. There are 2 days of my life I have no memory of. Except my uncle, who's a doctor, rushing me to the hospital in Birmingham because of the lupus, and they didn't know what else was going on. He rushed me to the hospital, and I lay in that hospital for just a couple of days that time. And I made a decision that it was either now or never. And when I was released from the hospital on this occasion, I put my application together for law school. That is what sent me to law school.
And what made you choose Howard?
It's history. It's history. I applied for 3 schools. I didn't get into Alabama. I was accepted at Howard, and I was accepted at Cumberland. And so when I got the acceptance from Howard, that was it for me. It was where I wanted to go. It was so rich in history, and the history that it had played in the civil rights movement, and the way it was thought of in the community that I grew up in. Funny thing happened. So you have to send reference letters to Howard along with your application. And there was a lawyer over at the AG's office named Milton Belcher, who was one of my professors when I was in grad school. And he wrote the letter, and he gave it to his secretary, and she sent it to Harvard as opposed to Howard. And I remember he called and he said, "You better be glad I caught it." You know, he said, "But your letter actually went to Harvard." And when she gave it to me, I had to explain to her, no, it's Harvard. But they thought of, in my neighborhood, in my family, Howard was like Harvard for black folks.
So I don't want to demean other HBCUs, but I do think that there are many people who would say that Howard is the preeminent, most prominent law school.
I don't want to demean them either, but I would echo that sentiment.
Yeah. So how did you like it at Howard?
It was tough. Had never studied like that before in my life. You know, absent my first semester at University of Alabama, I had done pretty well at school. And I hate to keep jumping all over the place, but when my family moved from Huntsville to Montgomery, I was a mediocre student in school. Wrestling was all that existed in my life. That's it. And so my grades were B's, C's, and D's. You know, half the time I was on punishment for my grades. When we moved to Montgomery, I was so upset with my mom and with the world that I just isolated. I had no friends here in Montgomery beyond the wrestling team, and I started studying for the first time in my life. My senior year, I probably made the best grades from 9th grade to senior year that I had ever made. I made all A's and B's. I mean, I was killing it. So by the time I go off to school, the little junior college I go to is in Phoenix City, Alabama, and there's nothing to do in Phoenix City, and I had no car. I started making good grades, and did not know that was happening to me. It's just, I was a much better student than I thought I was. So did well there, didn't do so well first semester at Alabama. The next semesters at Alabama did extremely well. And so by the time I come out, I'm thinking, law school, maybe, no. And I'm maybe unable to get a job with the criminal justice degree that I want for a year. And so I go right back to school, and I go to Auburn here in Montgomery, and I obtain a master's degree over the next couple of years. Did my best. Made 1 B throughout my whole time.
Where'd you get your master's degree in?
Justice and public safety.
Okay.
I just was a very good student. I get to Howard, it's a different kind of studying. It's not like working on your master's. It's not like taking information and then regurgitating it to your professor in class, and while he talk about it, take notes. It's engaging. They use what's called the Socratic Method, where they put you on your feet and they start throwing questions at you, and they expect you to answer the questions. And they take the fact pattern from the case that you have read, and they start changing the fact pattern and ask you if that changes your opinion about the case or how it should have been, the outcome. That was very different to me. They also gave you more material than you could possibly read each night, you know, and I just couldn't keep up. So that first year I struggled. I struggled extremely hard. And I kept thinking about, unlike the other students, well, most of them anyway, that I was married, that I had, my wife had quit her job to come up here, that I no longer had a job, and that everything was just on the line. So I put a lot of pressure on myself, and that transition, thinking about that wrestling part of my life and how, you know, when I was like the kid on the team who couldn't beat anybody and then became captain of the team. It's like, how did you get there? What did you do? Well, you spent more time in the gym. You started taking chances. You started doing things differently. And so I did. So by the time we get to second year, all that starts to change. My grades are getting better. I moved over 100 places in my class, a class of like 150. And so just started moving up. And then my wife gets pregnant that second year, more pressure. You now have a kid, you are here in Washington, D.C. Only people we know are our godparents for our child who's born. And so the pressure was really on, but started to do extremely well in law school, and then would go on to take a couple of summer jobs, and had no job offers by the time I finished law school. And it wasn't for want of trying.
We're going to go there in just a second. I want to ask you, was there any professor or anyone that you encountered while you were in law school that is someone that you would say was someone you'd like to mention or talk about, or
yes, there were,
and extol maybe the virtues of, or just share the advice that you got?
Sure. My first professor, first year, taught torts. His name was J. Clay Smith. Professor Smith was the dean when I graduated. He taught torts my first year. I got a C in torts, and I ran into him in one of the grocery stores in D.C. And I saw him. He was with his wife, and he saw me, and I walked up to him, and he said, "So how'd you do in my class?" And I kind of dropped my head. And he said, "Well, maybe I need to run." I said, "No, sir." And I said, "I got a C in your class. I scored a 76 on the final." And he looked at me and he said, "Then you have all the tools you need to become a lawyer," which was affirmation that I needed at the time, because, like I said, my first year was not a good year. He was around the campus a lot, and he was in the library all the time. He was considered by people in my class as the hardest working professor on campus. He was published on occasion, but he was always writing and researching something. So we held him in high regard. I remember one of my dear friends who was in my study group, she had this huge crush on him. She just thought he had all kind of swagger. And he was really good in the classroom. And just a quick little note about how I was treated in front of him. I wore a pink button-down shirt to class one day, and he called on me. And before he would get to the case that he was going to ask me about, he asked, as he would with all kids, "So where are you from?" And I said, "Birmingham, Alabama, from Montgomery." "Alabama?" And the next question was, "Do you know Myron Thompson?" And I did not know who Myron Thompson was at the time. It's like, "No, sir." And he proceeded to tell me who Myron Thompson was. And then he started badgering me with the questions. And I did not get the first answer was wrong. The second was wrong. And what they do at Howard is, if you get them wrong, they just leave you standing. They don't say you can sit down. If you sit down, they'll tell you, "I didn't tell you to sit down." You just stand. So I'm standing there for the next hour, But he would call on me later in the semester, and he remembered how badly I had done. And he said, "Looks like you got a rowboat and got back to land." And so he had an influence. He had a huge influence on me while I was there. Another professor was Professor Schumann, who taught property, Jerome Schumann. He drove an old raggedy car to campus every day. He would come in the classroom and he had one folded sheet of paper that he kept inside his jacket. And he would pull out and he would put it back in occasionally, but mostly he taught the class without anything. And he knew those cases backwards and forwards. And one day we saw him on campus, and he was driving a Rolls Royce on campus. And we asked, And we would later find out that he was a millionaire. And at the time, that was a huge deal for us. But he was this very quiet, unassuming man. And he would later tell us that when he went to law school, he would take the books that had all of the case law in it, and he would break them down. And he would take only the pages of a case and put it inside his jacket and would read it at every point he could get to make sure he knew what the case was to help him with his classes. And that's how he got through. And he also told us that when he left law school, he learned how to save money. He said, every raise that I would get, I told myself, I could survive on this level of money, and every raise that I get, I would take that money and invest most of it and just give myself a slight raise and maintain my lifestyle. And that's the way he became a multimillionaire. And there were other people other than those two, but those are just two who come to mind. And then you had these great speakers who came to campus and they talked to us. I remember it was a huge deal advocating for Dr. King's acknowledgement of a holiday for his birthday. That occurred while I was in law school. And what we were pushing out from the campus. In fact, I was asked to speak to the other students. And my brother was there. He had a chance to see me speak to at the auditorium to the other students. Was that we would not allow people to commercialize Dr. King's birthday. That we had all vowed, informally of course, to not ever shop on Dr. King's holiday, that we would hold it sacred and do something. And Professor Schumann would say things like, he always works on holidays, and what he would say is, my ancestors were slaves and they worked every day, so I work every day. So that was the value of Howard University. And the last thing I would add to that is this. For the first time in my life, I was in class that I could remember, with majority black students who were the best and the worst in the class. At the University of Alabama, there were so many classes, and during my master's program, where I was the only black person there, which was largely my first part of my career at the U.S. Attorney's Office too. And you get this sense, and you don't think about it that much if you're focused on your job and why you're in this place. You don't think about, I'm the only black person here. But sometimes it just hits you and it's overwhelming. It's like, oh my God, I'm the only black person here. But, being at that university and having kids from all over the world, not just the United States. There were kids from Africa and Japan and other places that were at that campus. And they were awesome. I mean, one of my classmates, I'm not gonna call her name, but she slept through every class we had. You could look over there and she would be asleep. And if a professor called on her, her eyes would open up and she stood up and she could answer any question that professor had. And we would just all just be in awe. It's like, how does she do that? She is now a federal judge in Washington, D.C. But just those are the kind of people I met at Howard, and that was very inspiring to me to be in that place. I could not have picked a better school to go to.
Now, this professor that asked you if you knew Myron Thompson, did he know Myron Thompson?
He did.
Okay. Did you later have an opportunity? I'm going to jump forward, and then we'll come back. But I think it's a good time to segue to that. Did you ever have an opportunity to meet Myron Thompson, and did you ever have an opportunity to share that anecdote with him?
Yes, and yes. I met Judge Thompson when I first started practicing here in 1990. I attempted to share that anecdote with him, but he was so standoffish. It was during my early years at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But at my retirement, I stood up and I told that story because I knew he was there. And that's the first time I ever shared that with him. It turns out that Judge Thompson introduced J. Clay, Professor Smith, to his wife, that his wife was a good friend of Judge Thompson. And I did not even know that until we were working on a big case and you and I met Brenda Morris, and she knew J. Clay Smith much better than I did, and his wife. And she told me about that connection.
Well, and I want you to know, I remember you telling the story at your retirement. I was there. This was just within the past year, and I was sitting close enough to Judge Thompson to watch him when you told that story, and I can tell you that he got a big kick out of it. He laughed. I don't know if you know that or not, but I was watching him.
It's one of my small world stories. Never wore that pink button-down shirt to class ever again.
So, okay, so you graduated from Howard in
87.
87, and what did you do then?
I returned home. My son was 6 months old, and we had to make a decision about money. I wasn't working, Lucretia was working, and so we decided that I would come home and start studying for the bar and leave Lucretia in D.C. to continue earning a living. Move back in with my parents, with me and Louie. My son and I are very, very close back then. I took care of him while she worked. And so I came home, moved in with my parents, with Louie, and started studying for the bar. And while doing that, was offered a job at Legal Services down in Selma. Obviously, I took the job because I was trying to get the family back together. And so after taking the job at Legal Services, then Lucretia quit her job in D.C. and moved back home.
What kind of work did you do at Legal Services?
Represented indigent folks. Found out just how much people don't know about law. It was a very eye-awakening experience to represent people who were indigent and to explain to them what their rights are, what they should have done. I think the worst part of Legal Services was that by the time a client walked through the door, the damage had already been done. Default judgment had been entered. For some reason, indigent people get messages in the mail, complaints on the doors, and they just throw them in the garbage can thinking it'll all go away until after that default judgment is in it. Then they want to come see you and say, can you fix this? The first thing I learned was that most poor people thought that debtor's court existed, or debtor's jail, debtor's prison existed. And the first question they would always ask, am I going to go to jail for not paying this bill? And I could always assure them that they were not going to jail. They might lose some money, but they were not going to jail. And had to figure out how to represent them without having much to work with. I repaired doors, appliances, and other things around people's rented houses so that they could stay on their Section 8 housing. My favorite case from my time at Legal Services was a woman who was being evicted from her house. And she came to me and she said, Mr. Franklin, I just need you to keep me in my house till after Christmas. I need a place for me and my kids to spend Christmas. She had not paid her rent. There was nothing the landlord had done to allow us to keep her in the house. And I just told her I would do the best I can. Show up in court on the day for the trial of the eviction. And the judge calls everybody in the back. And this is in December. And for whatever reason, I didn't ask for it, he moved the whole docket to January. And I came out and I said, well, you're going to get to stay in your house for Christmas. She literally hugged me and picked me up off my feet and pronounced in the courtroom that I was the best lawyer ever. And I was so embarrassed. I remember saying to her, would you please put me down? And I said, look, the judge, I didn't do anything. The judge just continued the docket. You're going to be put out of your house come January. You need to find another place to stay. But that was the joy of working with indigent folks, that they were so appreciative of you fighting for them in court. So I loved the job. It didn't pay very much, and legally it wasn't very challenging.
So how long did you do that?
I did that for about 3 years, a little less than 3 years.
Okay, and what happened to cause you to leave?
I got a call from Calvin Pryor, who was an assistant U.S. attorney here in Montgomery. And he said, and a family friend. And although I had known Calvin most of my life, I'd always ask Calvin, take me to work with you. What do you do? I know you're a lawyer. He never would. And I knew he worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So when he called me, I was kind of shocked. And he said, we have a position open. You need to apply. It's like, I don't know if I want to do that, Calvin. So what will I be doing? Because I didn't know, what the U.S. Attorney's Office did back then. And he said, well, you're going to be a prosecutor. And it just didn't resonate with me, because going to law school, being a prosecutor was not on my radar. It was not something I ever thought I would be. And having gone to Howard University, I thought I would be the thorn in some DA's, office. I thought I would be representing defendants, not prosecuting them. And so I said, okay. And then I started thinking about it. I did a little digging into what kind of job it was and the kind of people that work at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I did not think that I wanted to do that or that I was qualified.
And when was this?
This was in 1989.
Okay.
We rock along for a couple of weeks. I go to a conference in Birmingham for legal services. They send someone from the conference to call me out and say, you need to call home. And I think something is seriously wrong. So I get up and I go and I call home. And Crucia says, Calvin called. He said he has not seen your resume in this office. He wants you to call him right away. So I call Calvin. And in his fatherly voice, he tells me that I had better be at the U.S. Attorney's Office at 8 o'clock the next morning with resume in hand. And so I leave Birmingham and drive back to Selma because I didn't have a resume. And I type up a resume on my little IBM Junior computer. And I take it to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I get it there at 8 o'clock the next morning as instructed by Calvin. And then I get an interview.
Who'd you interview with?
I interviewed with Jim Wilson.
Who was he?
Jim Wilson was the U.S. Attorney at the time. I interviewed with Broward Segrist, who was the first assistant. And I interviewed with Charlie Niven, who was the criminal chief. Interview went fairly well. They were very clear in telling me that part of their interest in me is because I was black, that there were no black prosecutors in the office. And Jim Wilson, who's the U.S. Attorney, he said, and I think it's time. He said, we need to have a black prosecutor in the office. And one of the questions he asked me was, I need to know if you're somebody who would prosecute their grandmother if they jaywalked. And I jokingly responded to him, I can do that.
Yeah. Let me tell you what, Lewis, you have established that is the truth. You are definitely an equal opportunity prosecutor.
Let me add this though. What I should have said to him was, does that include your grandmother too? That's what I should have asked him.
That's right.
Hopefully we'll get to that later. But it was a long process to get hired. And so that, I had another interview after that, and the offer was made. When they made the offer, I was asked how much money I was making at legal services, and I told him, and the U.S. Attorney actually laughed. And he said, we'll have no problems convincing you to come here. So I started at the base rate, and that was in August. I didn't start until February. I remember the day I was sworn in. It was February 12, 1990. Excuse me, because all of my family was there. Back in 1990, if you were sworn in as an assistant U.S. attorney, it was a big deal. And right before I was sworn in, they had just outlawed cameras being in the courtroom because they used to have cameras in the courtroom. I remember the AUSA who was sworn in before me back in December of '89. Her picture, the camera, I think, was in the courtroom, and they actually showed her on the news that night because I was watching the news and said, oh, they hired somebody else. I'm still waiting to get my clearance to go and work. And so all of my parents were there. My son was 3 years old. My daughter was 10 months old when I started working at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So what did an assistant United States attorney make back in 1989?
when they made me the offer, it was like 38 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I got there, I had gotten a raise in January. So I started around just a tad shy of 40. Yeah, because the big deal was getting to 40 at that time. Yeah, so that was it, you know. They do a little better now.
They do. They do. Times have changed. Inflation, lots of things have happened. I know my first job when I left the Air Force to go to work in the DA's office here in Montgomery was for $23,000 a year. So
Public service comes at a cost.
Yeah, yeah. You don't go into it to make money.
That's right.
So you accepted the position?
I did.
Went to work?
I did.
And what kinds of things did you do when you first started at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
The first thing they did was they handed me a 3-ring binder that was about 5 inches thick, and it was a pornography case. Back then, and I think it's still true today, it's against the law to send pornography through the mail. And so they hand me this case, and I'm sitting there, and I'm going through it. I'm spending all my days reading administrative stuff that you need to know it as Assistant United States Attorney. And they give me that 3-ring binder, and I'm going through it trying to figure out how I'm going to prosecute this case, because I don't know what I'm doing. There's no training, and nobody spent a whole lot of time with you back then. And then the criminal chief walks in, and he hands me a case that an AUSA has just indicted like 5 cases in front of the grand jury, and obviously he can't do them all. He said, I want you to work this up for trial. I had not had a jury trial before. And he said, we're going to trial in 2 weeks. I want you to work this up for trial. And so I start working on that. And the first conversation, he says, I want you to handle 1 or 2 witnesses. And he comes back the next day, he said, I want you to do an opening statement. And next thing you know, it progresses to I'm handling all of the witnesses on the government's case in chief and doing the opening statement. I had to do my opening statement in front of Charlie Niven, who was the chief of the criminal division, before I did it. And that was my first 2 weeks in the office. So in 2 weeks, I was in trial in front of Judge Dabena.
I remember that happening to me when I went in the Air Force. A week after I got in, I was trying my first criminal trial. It was a court-martial with a jury. I had never done any moot court work. I had never tried any kind of case at all. And I remember my reaction, but I'd like for you, if you would, to share for posterity what was going through your mind when you're preparing for that first trial. So I want you to share, because I'm going to encourage young lawyers. I know you've had an opportunity to teach many people, and you and I both now have, I think it's widely known, have extensive trial experience, both of us. But I know I was scared to death that I was going to fall on my face, that I was going to make a fool of myself, and that I was going to be told I was not fit to be a lawyer. And I just want to know what your reaction was and what was going through your head, because, Lewis, for me anyway, and I think you and I share this view, there's so many people out there that probably could be really fantastic trial lawyers, but they never give themselves a chance because they're afraid of failure. And so they find other things to do, and they never really explore that opportunity to learn whether or not they could be a good litigator. But I don't know what you feel about it, and I want to give you an opportunity to put that on camera, because I think it's important for people to know. I
share all of what you just said. I was nervous. I was scared to death. I had never done it. And then there was this other side of it, in addition to what you said. There was Calvin Pryor, who had asked me to put in for the job, and always lingering in the back of my head was, I did not want to make Calvin look bad. I wanted Calvin to be proud of me and what I did in the office. And so Charlie Niven, who you know, he's a little strange, but a good guy. So Charlie, I don't know whether he thought it was fun, but it really...
I would say he had some interesting idiosyncrasies.
Yes, he did. So we go down there, and he asked me, he said, have you ever struck a jury before? And I tell him, I said, no, I haven't. And so we got the witnesses prepped, I got the witnesses prepped, and we go down there to strike the jury, and we walk up to the bench, and Judge Dabena's on the bench, and Charlie walks away. He just leaves me there. And I remember all of my fear that I was having and the anxious moment that it was turned to anger. It's like, why did he leave me here? You know, he knows I don't know what I'm doing. But I got angry, and it was like, oh, he thinks I can't do this. And so something in me was like, just fake it. Just do the best you can. And so I started watching what all the other lawyers were doing, and I just emulated what I saw. I didn't know what I was doing. But we picked a jury. I picked a jury. We tried the case in a day. It was an absolute joy to try my first case in front of Judge Davino, who I just hold in the highest regard. I loved being in the courtroom when he was on the bench. And I didn't try many cases in front of him, but I tried my first in front of him, and he made me feel comfortable. We got through the case, and it was impersonation of an FBI agent case. And so it's kind of humorous, you know, but it had a dangerous element to it in that the guys who were posing as FBI agents were trying to get two women in the car with them, and we don't know what would have happened to them if it had been successful. Other interesting thing about the case is one of the defendants had only been out of prison from serving a 99-year sentence in state prison. He'd only been out for 48 hours at the time that this incident happened. And so, and he was on bond. We didn't think anything would happen to our victims, and I certainly was not savvy enough at that point to make any motions to have him detained, because I was picking up the case. I didn't know anybody in the case for 2 weeks, and now I'm in trial. But we were successful, and we got a conviction. In addition to making Calvin happy, I had made Charlie happy, which was really important to me. It was the first time I ever saw Charlie smile in the elevator going back up, because I was so excited, you know, and I was just grinning all over myself that I had won my first federal trial. And Charlie was happy, which made me, because in my interviews with Charlie, he said nothing, and he was just sitting there like something smelled bad in the room. And I, you know, trying to figure out who's in the room. And you know Broward and his personality, and Jim Wilson was in control of the interview, and so all of that went well, but I couldn't get a read on Charlie. But after I won that trial, my relationship with Charlie started off on the right foot. That case...
And he was your immediate supervisor as chief of the criminal division.
That's right. That case would go to the 11th Circuit and be reversed based on a defect in the indictment. It came back, and I started writing the brief. Rand Neely had joined the office in June. And so Rand looked at the transcript, and he came to me and he said, "Lewis, we have an issue here that I think we should take to the 11th Circuit." And so after they had reversed us, this is the next year, we ended up asking for an in-bank hearing. And it was granted.
This is before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals.
Before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals.
Was it the 11th then, or was it still the 5th?
No, it was the 11th.
Okay, they changed.
And I actually had to argue the case before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. It was my first oral argument. And Rand Neely, who helped me with the brief, we wrote the brief. First of all, before appealing a district court judge, you have to get permission from the Department of Justice. We didn't know that. Rand and I, we did not know that. So we go to Broward.
It's a big rule book.
Yeah, it is. We go to Broward, and we say to Broward, we think we have an issue that we can win on appeal on this case, and we think we should appeal. And Broward says, go for it. Just as casual, nothing about you have to get permission from the Department of Justice. So we go in this thing without getting permission from DOJ. And we win. We actually win. And later on, Rand and I would figure out that we had violated these rules and you know, just stayed quiet about it. But it was a great moment. During the oral argument, my first one, again, nervous, scared, I stand up before the podium and after they call the case, and nothing comes out, nothing. And I actually do this in front of the judges on the panel. I do this, and I step away from the podium because I was just so nervous. I breathe. I go back to the podium, and Judge Johnson is on my panel.
This is Frank Johnson.
Frank Johnson.
The judge who this courthouse is named after.
That's right. I fell in love with this man at that moment. He throws me a softball question. And once he did that, it was like my old days in the gym. You're nervous, you're real nervous, your heart's beating fast, you got butterflies in your stomach, you know. And once you touch your opponent, everything goes silent. You're in the moment, you're doing your thing, you're really on automatic pilot. And so after Judge Johnson asked me that question, I was in that moment. And I start talking about the facts before we get to the law. Start talking about the facts, and then we move into the law. And before I know it, my time is up. And I sit down. My friend, my good friend, your friend to this day, Rand Neely. Well, what's wrong? What happened? Why didn't you say anything? and I can't tell you what I said to him because it wasn't anything nice. But grateful to him for helping me write that. And that was my first case and my first time getting published.
So share with young lawyers, and you know what, I hate to make it just young lawyers because there's a whole lot of older lawyers that don't go to court much, again, because they're afraid of what might happen, you know. And we know this, I mean, because we're the older lawyers now, right? I mean,
yes.
we've been around these people, and one of the things I want to, your observation on is, I have found that most judges are judges because they were cut out to be judges. There's some bad ones, but most of them are good at what they do. They're good at that thing. It takes a specific type of person to be a judge and to be a good judge, and they tend to gravitate to that. One of the things that I found, and it helped me survive my early career, learning how to litigate by tripping over myself and making every mistake you could make,
Right.
was that the judges know that you're inexperienced, and they help you because they have an obligation to see that justice is done. What's your observation on that?
Some help you.
Okay.
Some punish you. Some help you. That's my observation.
Yes.
I will say, for the most part, in this courthouse, I have been raised by the judges and taught by the judges how to prosecute cases in a very gentle, not always, but in a very gentle way. I had one case in front of Judge Dabena, and I had never read United States versus Beaujolais, which talks about co-conspirator statements. Had never read the case, and I was trying to get a statement, a co-conspirator statement in. I knew the rule, but I hadn't read the case. And so I get an objection, and Judge Dabena, at the break for lunch, he calls me up to the bench, me and defense counsel, and he asked me, have you read United States versus Beaujolais? And I said, no, Your Honor, I haven't. He said, well, if you're going to prosecute cases in this courthouse, you need to read that case. And I went and read that case during lunch. And I know that case, and I know what it stands for. That was the gentle way to help somebody learn.
So you raised another issue there.
Yes.
Do you have any advice or thoughts, looking back over your career, about what you do when you're in a courtroom and a judge asks you something? What's the number one thing on your mind when that judge asks you a question?
Well, it depends on the question. I'm sorry. That's who I am. It just depends on the question. I have learned over the years the number one rule in the courtroom, and this is what I was taught in the U.S. Attorney's Office, is respect the robe. That's the number one rule. Respect.
What do you mean when you say respect the robe?
Regardless of who's wearing it, respect the robe. The judge can be right, the judge can be wrong, but respect the robe. And so whatever the judge asks you, you try to address the question first, and then you move on from there. And so I've learned early on, you know, don't be a smart butt, you know, with the judge. Try to answer the question, respect who you're standing in front of and where you are, because it's like a sacred place for most lawyers to be in the courtroom practicing. That was the first rule. But for me, Steve, it just depended on what the question was. And you know, try to answer the question.
Try to answer the question. That's
Try
what
to
I'm
answer
getting
the
at.
question.
But try to answer it
Yes.
so that that judge knows that what you're telling him is your best shot at the most truthful answer you can give him.
Yes, and as a prosecutor, that is expected of you. It's a higher standard that we are held to when we're in the courtroom. And so, yes, it's not, let's argue about this. Well, let me tell you what I'm doing. First, answer the question. And then if you get an opening, try to get, your reasoning, your position, your assertions in front of the court. But first thing, answer the question.
Do you remember when you're in front of a judge and you're working with a judge that you're probably going to see that judge again and again and again? Is that something that factors into it?
Initially, no, but as time went on, yes. And because the Middle District is a small district, you get to know who your judges are. You get a feel for what they like, what they don't like, and what they will do, which is much different from what we do right now because we travel all over the state and we run into all different personalities wearing the robe. But again, still, when I'm in state court, respect the robe.
So that first case, you told us what it was about. Did you, at some point in time, begin to be assigned particular types of cases? And if so, was it because that's what you wanted, or was that what management needed you to do? How did that work?
I did get assigned particular kinds of cases, but not initially. That first case was something just Steve Reynolds, an assistant in the office, had indicted too many cases and couldn't get to. The next case is, I don't remember what was next, but there was a variety of cases, not just the porn case. I remember that played out. Then there were bank robberies and just a host of other kinds of cases. But at some point, Jim Wilson decided that he wanted me to do dope cases. I had some success. I think I did one with an assistant by the name of Rachel Lee, who was an outstanding prosecutor in the office. And I was tagging along with her trying to learn how to do cases. And Rachel was a JAG in the Army or in the Air Force. And so she knew what she was doing in the courtroom, and I thought it was just an honor to be with her in the courtroom, start learning how to do this. And I learned a lot from Rachel. So we tried an individual in a week-long trial, and a cousin of mine shows up as a witness in the trial. I didn't know she was going to be there. And so Rachel had to take her on cross, and I watched Rachel do this fantastic cross-examination of her. That was my first introduction to cross-examination. Just destroyed her as a witness on the stand. And I was started getting these dope cases left and right, and moved on from there. So by 1991, I become the lead attorney for the OCDEF program, which is the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force program, which was designed to prosecute drug organizations that had an identifiable structure that involved multi-jurisdictions. That means it went outside of the Middle District of Alabama, and later would become one of the other components. You had to have a monetary component to it, in that there was money laundering associated with the drug trafficking organization. And so I did that from 1991 up until I left the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Let's talk about that. So you were there for 12 years, and then you said you left the U.S. Attorney's Office.
I was actually there for 6, and I left. In 1995, 1996, March, I decided to venture into private practice. But let me back up, because I want this this one case to be documented. The first crack cocaine case I had involved a woman, and I'm not going to call her name because it's not important, out of Crenshaw County. I was sitting in my office. I rarely went to lunch. I was always working in my office at lunch, and the agents knew that. So they'd come around lunchtime and try to get their cases. They would pitch their cases to me. We had 2 DEA agents to cover 23 counties here in Alabama, Middle District. And one of them walked in my office and said, "Lewis, you got to take this case. Our target is an employee of the Crenshaw County courthouse, and the DA will never get a conviction for this woman if they have to try the case in Crenshaw County. So I said, tell me about the case. And they started telling me about the case. And the facts are that one night, an 86-year-old woman went to her door to answer a knock at the door. And she allowed someone in her home that she knew. He asked for money, and then he beat her to death with her own walking cane in her house. She was 86 years old. And he left her house having stole approximately $100+, like 112, just a little over $100. And he went to a crack house and he bought crack with that money. And they were asking me to go after the people who ran the crack house, which was a woman, a husband, their son, and a nephew of the female defendant, the lead defendant in the case. I agreed to take the case. I go down, start interviewing people, and I figure out that we need the murderer to make this case. We had an informant who had gone in the house, but we needed the murderer to tell how many times he had been to that house and bought crack cocaine. So they set me up with an interview of the individual who had pled guilty to murdering this woman and was doing a life sentence based on her murder. We interview him, and I tell him, you know, I need your testimony. I can't offer you anything because you're in state custody. I can't make you any promises, except you'd be doing your neighborhood a favor if you testify against these people. He tells me no, he can't do it. He's not a snitch. And I know, I had learned a little bit about his history before we went down there. I'm trying to make this quick, but this is very important to me. He was an ordinary guy growing up in Crenshaw County, got married, had 2 daughters, and his wife had an aneurysm and died, leaving him with 2 girls. He began to struggle and reached for crack cocaine to help him get through the day. He becomes a crackhead, and his path leads him to Miss Annie McGee's house. He was decedent, and he kills her that night. When they find him in question, he owns up, he confesses to what he did. So that told me he had some redeeming value, that, you know, he wasn't just this murderer, he was something more than that. And I had heard about the daughters, and so 2 things occurred to me to ask him about. One was a statement, and the other one was a question. The statement was, we have an obligation, he's a black man, to do what's right by our own communities, and that he had an obligation to help us with this case because he could not undo the harm that he had done. The second thing that occurred to me was the question to ask him, and I think this was the tipping point for him. You have 2 daughters. What do you think she will do if your daughters show up at her house in the middle of the night to buy dope? And that took him aback. I remember the expression on his face. He leaned back in his chair and he just did not know what to say. He didn't give me an answer that day. But about a week later, I get a call from the agent and said, got a call from Ernie McCassell. He says he'll testify for you. So Terry Moore and I, who was another assistant in the office and now a federal judge in Mobile, district court judge, we try the case. And we prep Ernie McCassell to be a witness. This man was an absolute great witness on the stand. All the defense attorneys did on cross-examination was anger him, and he gave them more information than I pulled out of him on direct. And he told his story about how he killed Miss Annie McGee, about how many times he had been to that house, how they owned everything that he owned that was electronic in his house was at that house because he had traded it for crack cocaine. And she was sentenced. All of them were found guilty. But that case stayed with me. And it gave me a passion for doing what I was doing in prosecuting these drug cases. And so as we moved forward in doing these cases, when the issue came out about crack versus powder and how it's all the same drug and the disparity between the two, I would always think about Miss Annie McGee and how her life ended. It wasn't powder cocaine, might have been at some point, but it was crack, and what crack had done to neighborhoods like the one I lived in and grew up in. And so it made me kind of a villain with some folks, but I was real steadfast and believed.
I wanted to ask you about that because
what I did.
I'm aware of that, but I want you to make a record of it, and this is an opportunity to do it. Your zeal to help stamp out the horror that is the drug problem that still exists. Did that bring you unpleasantness in any way in your personal life? Were you ever afraid for the safety of you or your family at any time while you were doing any of this?
I was not ever afraid. I just didn't think that way. I had received some threats, nothing major until later on. There was really only one credible threat that needed to be investigated, and I'm not going to get into that. But most of it was just anger of family members and friends of people that I was prosecuted. I will say this, that everybody needs to know that as a black prosecutor, I was always treated differently by the defendant and their family as opposed to the white prosecutors. I remember being in court one day, and I had only gotten in the case to help Rand Neely at the last minute, and we were prosecuting this woman out of Tuskegee. She had never seen me. I only agreed to help Rand like 2 days before the trial. He said, "Lewis, I'm not comfortable, I need some help." And I said, "Sure, I'll help you." And we get in there, and I start handling most of the witnesses for Rand. And at the end of the trial, the woman motions to me to come over. And then she just launches into these expletives and telling me about how I have ruined her life. And I'm looking at her, and then I'm looking at Rand, who's standing there. And Rand doesn't say it, and I just look at her, and I just tell her, "You have a good life," and I just walk off. But that was something that I had to deal with, the difference, the way I was treated. And you will recall when we did the Carmichael case, the slight that he gave me when you and I went to visit him in prison. That was one of the things that I had to deal with, that somehow as a black prosecutor I was some kind of monster.
I know that what you're saying is true because I saw it happen on more than one occasion, and I wanted you to share it. So
yes,
please do.
That was just the way it was. The first time I didn't carry a gun. The first time I purchased a firearm for protection was after I had prosecuted 5 young black men for some drug conspiracy that they were involved in. And my agent walks up to me after we get the verdict, and he says, "Lewis, do you have a gun?" And I tell him, "No, I don't have a gun." He said, "Well, you're going to need one because they're talking about whooping your behind when you leave this courtroom today." One of the things I think that added fuel to the fire was I would always make my personal arguments, my closing arguments personal to the defendant. I would say things based on the evidence that had presented in the courtroom. For example, and this may sound a little cold, but these are things that need to be said and people need to know. The defendant's mother got on the stand, and she testified that her son didn't have a pot to pee in or a window to throw it out of. Now, we just finished trial, and I put on these pictures of him owning a nightclub, him driving around in a Corvette, and the Rolex watches on his wrist. And she tells the courtroom, if he got locked out of his house, I had to go get him a key because he couldn't afford to get a key. And so in my closing, I looked at her, and I looked at the jury, and I told the jury, I said, as long as we have mothers like this, we're going to have defendants like him. And the defendant's sister was a doctor. She comes out of her pew because she's sitting in the audience. "That's my mama you talking about." I mean, just vicious. And I go right on with my closing statement. So some of that was a result of the way I handle my cases. I would give defendants respect, but if you're going to go down that road and put that kind of evidence in front of the jury, then I'm going to correct it in my closing and the way I handle my case, because I want the jury to see the actual brutality and the heinousness resulted with what drug dealing does to our communities. I would constantly put women on the stand to have them explain to the jury. Because the one thing I did know, that if there was a woman witness in the case, she has probably slept with every defendant on the other side for crack cocaine or any other kind of drug. And I would get them to tell their stories to the jury. So I would try to make the jury understand, number one, why we're here. Number two, why this needs to be dealt with and corrected. And so it did draw. It drew. I did get some blowback. My secretary was pregnant, and I had just gotten a guilty verdict on a guy, and we were walking out of the courtroom going back to the office. This is when the office was in the old courthouse, and his child was behind me, and just, I'm gonna kill you. That's what she kept saying, I'm gonna kill you. And my pregnant secretary turned around and accosted, what did you say? And I grabbed her by the hand and I said, she's angry, let it go. And I turned around to this child was in high school, and I just said, you have a good day. And we walked on, you know. Another case, somebody was out writing down my tag number on my car, and my sister saw this and reported it to the marshals. But yeah, I was treated differently, and part of the reason I was treated differently because I was a black prosecutor.
We have to as prosecutors, and I want to thank you for sharing that with us. But we have to take into consideration that racism is real and it's out there, and it influences people's decisions because it's quite natural that it would. I mean, you can't live through it and with it and maybe be a victim of it and not have prejudices that you carry with you about that. And so it is something you have to take into consideration as a prosecutor whenever you stand up on your feet and you start talking publicly about a case, and when you make those decisions about what is and isn't, it shouldn't happen, and it's a delicate decision-making process. It is,
and I really didn't think about it when I started this. The only thought for me is what it had done to our communities, black communities. That was my thought process. I remember the first Batson challenge I ever received, and it was the case from Crenshaw County. And this young defense attorney accused me and Terry of violating Batson. In other words, striking a black person from the jury. And the look on my face and Terry's face, who is also an African-American prosecutor at the time, was just priceless. We looked at each other in amazement, like, are you kidding? And Judge Albritton was on the bench, and even he remarked after the trial, he said, I'll never forget the look on you and Terry's face when you got that Batson challenge, because, you know, it's like, are you kidding me? You know, and
which is for those on our camera, tell folks what Batson.
Well, Batson says you cannot strike somebody from sitting or participating in a jury based on their race. It says more than that, but in essence, that's what it meant for that trial. And we had been accused of striking an African-American person from sitting on a jury based on their race, which was ridiculous. But, you know, it changed the way I handle cases, because that was 1991 or 92. And it changed the way I handle cases. When I struck juries, I didn't even put race down. But from that point moving forward, I had to actually notate the race when I would do my little cheat sheet for striking juries. I said I had to notate race so that I could be prepared for the Batson challenge, because I had not done that before. But it only took one. And after that, because we had to scramble looking back, it's like, what is she going to say? You know, how is she going to make her case? And so we had to explain why we had struck this person. I don't remember what the reason was, but it certainly had nothing to do with the person's race. But yeah, that became an issue, and I had to start doing it. So I had to kind of evolve, you know. But it has been interesting over the years. I think one of the worst instances that I had to witness in federal court was a lawyer who I knew, who I had gone to grad school with, and considered him an acquaintance, not a friend. But in a closing argument, he actually, and this is a quote, he actually told the jury, America ain't what it used to be, but it ought to be a place where a bunch of street niggas like these can get a fair trial. And I was just so angry. I came up out of my chair and I screamed objection. And I was met by Judge Varner, who was sitting over the case. And he said, "Overruled. This closing argument, Mr. Franklin, sit down." And I had to sit down, and I was just so angry. I never spoke to that lawyer after that incident. I felt like if I said something to him, I might do something to him. It just angered me. So it's like, how dare you say that in this federal courthouse? You know, race had nothing to do with this case. How dare you try to interject? And I've had, you know, lawyers over the years to interject race into a case where it should not have played any part of, you know, based on the facts of the case. And so I became very sensitive to it, and I still remain sensitive to it to this day. I'm told by Debbie Shaw, who's my best friend and was my legal assistant for years, that one of the best closing arguments I ever gave was in a case where the defense attorney alleged that race was why we were there in the courtroom. And it was a drug case. But it was a drug case where we had prosecuted the white defendants who were getting the drugs after they came from Mexico. It involved the Mexican who brought the dope across the border. It was 3 Mexicans. They used a young Mexican courier and 2 Mexicans who were across the border in Mexico who sold the dope. And then it gets to Atlanta, they catch the guy and they deliver it to some white people here, and ultimately they give it to 2 young black men in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 cars passing in the middle of the night, the dope comes out of one car and goes into the other. Everybody pled guilty except my 2 black defendants, and I had to try them. But this was a case where I was accused of race being the motivating factor for getting us into court. And it was so offensive. And I don't even remember what my closing argument is. I think Debbie still has it. She held on to it. And she asked me later on, she said, "Do you remember what you said?" I said, "No, I don't remember what I said because I was so angry. I just let my feelings kind of dictate what I said in response to that." And you've seen it too. It happened in the McGregor case, where they took that case and they turned it from public corruption into a race issue, and it had nothing to do with race, even though our cooperators had these racist views. But that was not why we were in the case. But it's really offensive to me when that happens. But
and should be, and it is. That's a universal.
But you would be surprised at black lawyers here in town who think that that's okay to do that, to take race and interject it into a trial just so they could win. And I think that that's one of the things that makes good prosecutors better than most defense attorneys. And I'm not trying to lump them all into one thing, but you know, if you're willing to go that low to appeal to people's emotions instead of doing what the law requires, and that is base your decision on the facts of the case and the law as given to you by the court, then that's out of bounds, and it should be. But they think it's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And in fact, we were talking about a lawyer before coming in here, and I was telling you that he and I had a riff and we don't speak to each other anymore. He had done that, and he was a friend of mine, and he put race out as an issue as to why we were in court. And I wasn't even on the case, but he did it, and I admonished him for doing it, and it just the conversation just went really dark. And so, yeah, it's like, no, you and I, we just gotta go our separate ways because I just don't think that's fair.
You said that you left to go into private practice.
Yes.
I want to talk about that briefly, just so that you can, if you would tell people, what did you do the 2 or 3 years that you were in private practice? I remember when you left.
Yes.
I remember not wanting you to leave, and I remember wanting to get you back. And we ultimately did.
Yeah. You did get me back. It was a terrible time. The lure of money and of private practice was something I thought I would enjoy. I did defense work, represented companies and people who owned companies, and defended them from tort claims that had been filed against them, insurance defense work. Very, very boring work to me. There was nothing exciting about it, and eventually I left. I went to sorority and permute. The other thing that caused me angst while I was there, it was very structured, so you had to bill your time. I'm not a structured person. That did not go well for me. And so I had an awful time trying to bill hours, and I just realized that this was not for me. There was nothing about the work that I did that motivated me to dive that deep in the law to try to do it. You know, I knew I'd try cases, and I wanted to try cases, but they, and not just them, just the civil practice of law is not geared for trying cases. It's geared toward motion practice and settlement. And so after doing that 2 years, I called, and the one thing I had going for me is that you and Rand were in the office and knew how bad I wanted to come back and helped me make that happen. And the other thing I had going for me is the person who had taken over my program had put up goose eggs, had not done anything in the program, so I knew the program was suffering when I came back. But I am very grateful for you and Rand for helping me and get back over there, and even Redding Pitt for rehiring me so that I could come back. But that part of my life was probably the darkest part of my practicing law.
And I know I want to make sure you make clear, because I've talked to you about this. It had nothing to do with the people at sorority.
No.
They were great to you.
No.
I know that you've told me that.
No.
I had a similar experience. I tried private practice twice.
Yeah.
And I just, frankly, the biggest part of it that I didn't like, and I think you've shared with me, is the marketing aspect of it too.
Yes.
You have to market yourself constantly and regularly, and some people are not into marketing.
And I'm not.
You know?
I'm one of those people who's not into marketing. I was never going to be a rainmaker, and I watched people bring their friends in as clients, and it's like I don't have any friends that have enough money to be a client of mine. And then there was the guarding of the clients by the partners who were in there. You know, all of that. It was not an environment where I could thrive. I could survive, but it was not an environment where I could thrive. I had been accustomed to at U.S. Attorney's Office and even at Legal Services. Clients were knocking on the door every day. You know, we had a multitude of clients coming to see us at the U.S. Attorney's Office for us to prosecute their cases. I didn't have to beg for work. I always had plenty
One of the
work.
beauties of a legal education, I want you to talk about that for a second, is it opens the door for you to do so many different things.
Yes, it does.
And you can gravitate towards that which you enjoy and like. And it's evident to me from your career, and also because I know you so well, that what you gravitated to was government service and criminal law.
I did, and service in general. I just feel like as a prosecutor, I was able to give something back to the community. That has always been important to me. I think my love of working with kids, that was a way of trying to give something back to the community that I lived in. And I think maybe even after I stop practicing law, if that day ever comes, that I would probably end up volunteering with some kind of youth group to see if I could help save some of our kids.
Something some people I think that don't think about much, but I know you do, and that is when you prosecute a criminal case, we don't catch anywhere near all the people that break the law.
That's right.
But when you do prosecute a criminal case, you're helping people because you are deterring other folks that might have been inclined to commit a crime by virtue of knowing that the law will be enforced if you break it, and if you are caught, that you will be prosecuted. And so, fortunately, I think, and I know you would share this with me, but most people are good people that you can count on them to do the right thing. But there are people that need criminal laws in order to keep them in line.
I think that our society has always needed checks and balances, and that's what our criminal justice system is. I think that's what our court system is, and just life in general. I don't think you can count on people to do the right thing unless they know that people are watching. And I also believe in punishment too. I just believe that, you know, it's not just deterrence, but it's also punishment, because people need to atone for the things that they do. And you're right, we don't catch everybody. We really don't. And I think that in today's time, there's a lot of press. There is a lot of thought about what wrongs the criminal justice system has committed, the people who have been incarcerated unfairly. It's not a perfect system, but I think it works fairly well. I think that it works as well as the people who are in it and their commitment to doing their job. And I know over the years that you and I have always been very committed to make sure our job has been done correctly. We have dismissed a lot of cases where we saw there was a problem. We dismissed a lot of cases where we knew the defendant was guilty and saw we had a problem in proving the case, but also when there were other inequities that came up. And I don't want to get into much detail, but I recall one incident where I had to educate a younger prosecutor in the office that, and I actually used this word to tell him what he was doing. I told him that his racial IQ was too low and that we were going to dismiss that case. And we did, but you know, I tried to educate people in the office about matters of race when handling these cases. But one of the other things I did, and a lot of people take exception to this, is when young lawyers came in the office and they would write up their pros memo or any other kind of memo that came to me as criminal chief, and they would start off with the race and the status of a person that was a target of an investigation, I would go down to their office and I would correct them. This is not what we're looking at. What you're looking at is the conduct of the defendant and the evidence that we have, whether or not we can do this case. Those issues that you put in the memo is something that the court will look at when sentencing them, or somebody else will take a look at and have an issue with, but that's not what we're supposed to look at. And it goes both ways, and I struggle at times when I run into judges who try to correct past wrongs by doing something that is wrong in the future, if that makes sense. If they hand down a sentence because their belief that something was done improper long time ago, and I struggle with that. It's like two wrongs don't make a right. You know, our job is to look at what we have and deal with what we have. We certainly cannot correct past inequities, but so we can do right going forward.
We want to make sure that, and I'm going to say this on the tape, all of this stuff and all of these things that we've been talking about and the viewpoints that you've been sharing, they come from someone who sat for the extraordinarily long time of 20 years as the chief of the criminal division. And these are views that you learned, they're views you acquired, they're views you had coming into the job. But these are things that anyone listening to this should know. That's coming from somebody that was making these decisions on behalf of an office for 20 years. Now, let's then go to, and how did you become the United States Attorney? When did you become the United States Attorney? And let's talk about what you are proud of in terms of accomplishments in the office during your term.
In 2017, I made a decision to put my name in the hat for U.S. Attorney. It was not a decision I made lightly, as you know. You and Laura Canary and Debbie Shaw, we went to lunch and we talked about my decision to do this. I struggled with it for a number of reasons, and I'm not going to go into all of them because they're kind of personal. One of which is it would have meant the end of my career if I couldn't stay more than 4 years. And ultimately, you know that it did. But I thought about it a lot. And I had been criminal chief for 16 years. And I had done every kind of case that could possibly be done in the office. And as criminal chief and being in that management position, I saw my job as twofold. Number one, training up young lawyers to come in and take my place. And number two, trying to make sure we were consistent in what we did. I was very sensitive to all allegations that have been made against the office about anything. And so just trying to do a good job. And I thought, you know, if I'm U.S. Attorney, I could do an even better job. You know, I could manage the whole office. So after discussing it with you and Laura and other folks, to include my family, I decided to do it. And other lawyers around the country that I knew in different places, I called and asked. And everybody I talked to encouraged me to do it, so I did. One of the unfortunate things that happened when I made that decision was people came after me, didn't want me to have the job. And that was really unfortunate. And one of those people was Jim Wilson, who hired me as an assistant United States attorney. His wife started a petition to have my name removed from the list of candidates under the allegation that I was a lifelong Democrat and that I should not get one of these good Republican jobs. And that was wrong, and it hurt my feelings. It really did, because consistently every time I saw Jim out in public after he left the office, he would always tell me, "Lewis, you were my best hire. Lewis, you were my best hire." And for him to be a part of that, that really hurt. But I was fortunate enough to get past all of that and get the position. Tried to do some things differently than other U.S. attorneys, go places that they did not go. One of the things I felt very strongly about was making sure that law enforcement knew that we supported them, so I tried to do that. If a law enforcement officer or agent was hurt, I wanted to make sure that they knew, we knew about it, and that, you know, send some kind of sympathy card or something to the family, or actually go see them on occasions. We had 3 officer deaths here in the district after I was U.S. Attorney. And, you know, I was at the funeral for both. I talked to the families of both. I just wanted to make sure that law enforcement knew that the office supported them. We had a lot of people to leave the office, and I had to replace them, and I tried to replace them with folks who I thought would fit in and would make the office look good. So we made some really good hires. Even tried to get you to come back, but you wouldn't. We had a couple of conversations about that. I tried to recruit you back to the office because I thought that if I got you back, that you could help train and nurture young lawyers in teaching them how to try cases and how to be good prosecutors. Tried to get other people to come back who I had a lot of respect for, but they wouldn't. So we started from scratch, and we hired some folks who I think are really good and left them in the office. And I think the office was in a better place when I left, and I'll leave it at that.
Super, super. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you would like to talk about? We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
And I want to thank you for sharing all of this. I think my personal view of it is, again, I am a teacher too. I spent a significant part of my career teaching younger lawyers and older lawyers how to litigate in both the classroom and in the courtroom. I can't imagine anything better for somebody to sit down and watch that wants to hear about litigation and what you can expect and what you're going to need to be able to do, than to watch this and see it and be encouraged by it. But I now want to open it up to you. Is there anything you'd like to share?
And I don't want to go into it in detail, but first of all, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this. But just very quickly, there are certain types of cases, and I learned this from you, that you will take on that will change your life. And when you told me that, I disagreed with you. I would later apologize to you for disagreeing with you because you were right. And one of those cases was the Siegelman case. And we're not going to get into it in any big degree, but it did change our lives in terms of the oversight and the resources that some people have to bring to bear when being charged with a crime and how their resources can almost, and in one instance did, defeat justice. And so going through that case with you and the other young lawyers that we had at our side and the people who were on the other side was very eye-opening for me, because I am a rules person and I have this very keen sense of what's fair, what's right, and what's wrong. And so I did see inequities in the system that I had not seen before, that went way beyond race, that dealt with things like class and status. And I needed to see that. And I'm glad I did, and I'm grateful for it. I am grateful to have gone through that with you and the other people, with a really good case agent in Keith Baker and Jim Murray and the other folks who worked on that case, Debbie Shaw, Joseph Fitzpatrick, our friend from D.C., Richard Pilger, and
don't forget Javis, who kept us from starving to death.
and my sister, yeah. And one of the things that you may not remember, and I would like to document, is that at that time, my parents were sick, extremely sick. My stepfather, who I loved dearly, was dying from Alzheimer's, and my mom was sick. In fact, my stepfather had passed away, and my mom was actually living at my house after having gone through an operation, and was able to be there at the house. I could see her every night that I came home. And that was very important to me, to go through something like what we did and to stand together the way we did and to bond together the way we did. We would later learn that if you don't do that, you may not win. But
right.
that was
team effort.
That was one of the joys of being in the U.S. Attorney's Office and prosecuting that case. And as you recall, I wasn't the U.S. Attorney then. I was criminal chief and the acting U.S. Attorney on the case, and that I got it by default. Everybody else who had been the acting U.S. Attorney had left the office, and that left me as one of the senior management prosecutors in the office to take on that case. But I will always remember going through that case with you and JB and the rest of them, that prosecution team, and even Valley Birdsong, and Jenny Garrett. All of us worked extremely hard on putting that case together. We had a successful outcome. And I remember telling my son the night we were having our celebratory cigars and shots, that I hope that he has something that he can experience in his lifetime where he can work that hard at something and have it come together at the end and successfully see it through. So for that, I thank you. I thank the rest of the team. And that's really the only other thing I wanted to make sure got documented, because we could talk about that case for hours.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me echo those sentiments with you and say to you that, yes, when you walk through the crucible and the fire of a high-profile, for whatever reason, criminal case, you come out on the other side of that bonded in a way that you can't really truly describe it to anybody until you do it. Once again, an advocacy for young lawyers, any lawyer, to give themselves an opportunity to learn to try criminal cases. Don't give up out of fear that you'll fail. Give yourself that time and recognize that no one is good at it when they start. But the more you do it, the better you get at it. And every time you do one, you learn something.
Every time?
Every time.
Thank you,
Lewis. It's my honor and pleasure to be your friend, and thank you for letting me do this today.
Well, thank you for doing it, and I want to thank the courthouse for doing it. I never thought about my life having been anything that would warrant this kind of recognition. I've just tried to work as hard as I can when given an opportunity. And for young lawyers out there, I didn't ask to be criminal chief. I did ask to be U.S. Attorney, but every big thing that was thrown my way, I did not ask for it. It just came. I worked really hard and kept my head down and just worked. And somebody, as my stepfather says, as a general rule, the cream rises to the top and somebody will notice. And in my case, somebody noticed, and they tapped me to do some things, and I'm very honored to have done them. And U.S. Attorney is only one.
Well, I'm proud of you, and I know a lot of other people are too. So thank you.
Thank you.